Today, my husband Jackson is coming on the channel to share why he left the Mormon church. And so, Jackson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Many of you have asked in previous videos what led Jackson out of the church. He served his mission in Sweden. I obviously have my own story, which you're pretty familiar with. And so today will be from his earliest memories through us leaving together and what that entire process was like. You all may remember that Jackson and I left the church about a year after we got married in the temple, but there's a whole story that comes before that. So Jackson, I would love for you to share, what was your childhood like growing up in the church?
Sure. Well, I think a lot like you. My family goes way back in the church, on both sides for me, going back almost to the beginning. What that means is that the church was kind of always there. It was like the water we swam in, right? So I spent a lot of my childhood in like a small southern Utah town that my family has been in since it was founded. That meant that culturally I was really steeped in it. Every interaction was kind of in the culture of the church.
Yeah, I mean, people always think I'm from Utah. I didn't really live in Utah until I went to college, but you really were a Utah boy, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, eventually my mom moved out of the state and I spent some time in Nevada and Arizona, but the vast majority of my childhood was definitely spent in Utah.
Yeah, I think the story of your parents getting divorced is kind of a crazy story, if you want to share that.
Sure. So my parents split up when I was really little, like a toddler.
And they were both Mormon.
Yeah, they'd been married in the temple and they were both LDS. Eventually, without getting into all of the nitty-gritty, there was a custody battle. And I ended up going to live with my dad when I was 5. And one of the central themes that played out in the Utah courts was religious compatibility, which is really a strange concept if you think about it, that you're thinking about the religious compatibility of a 4 or a 5-year-old. Like what is the religion of a, you know?
Yeah, it's not like you're ultra devout at 4 already.
Yeah, and for context, my mom had distanced herself from the church by that time, and my dad was still very active. And that was something that Utah's court system took into account at the time.
Which is totally crazy because in this custody battle, because she chose to step away, they are using that against her as evidence of why she's not as fit to get custody.
Yeah, and to be clear, both my parents were very loving, kind. You know, I had a good mom and a good dad. So this, you know, I think parents will do what they have to do to try and have as much access as they can to their kids. But the fact that the court weighed religious compatibility in that at all, I think speaks to the church's influence in every facet of life in Utah.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think this custody battle would have played out in the same way anywhere else other than Utah. But it seems that because your dad was showing membership and your mom wasn't, they sided with your dad.
Yeah, I think that, you know, ultimately, I had 2 capable parents. I would have, I think, had a happy childhood wherever I ended up. But I do think it's strange to realize how much church membership weighed in as a factor in the court's decision there.
So your dad had primary custody, and wasn't there something where your mom tried to reverse the ruling?
Yeah, so there was a whole appeals process. It ended up going kind of all the way to the highest levels of the courts in Utah. And the determination of the court ultimately was that the religious basis of the decision that had been made initially wasn't valid, and actually that courts in Utah can no longer use religious compatibility in that way. But they didn't reverse the custody decision, basically on the grounds that, you know.
And it was already, I mean, that was a couple years, right?
Yeah, it had been some time, and basically they said, you know, this kid has 2 loving parents and seems well-adjusted, and it would be a big disturbance to change, you know, his living situation again. But because of that case, it fundamentally changed the way that religious compatibility can be used in custody cases in Utah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like whenever you first told me that story, when we were first, I think, dating, I was kind of shocked that I think most people watching will be shocked that they would side with a father over a mother, because typically, especially historically, women always get the kids in custody battles, which can move to the mother's detriment because she might not have the money to care for them. But it's crazy that in this case, the church was willing to override that cultural expectation and go with the dad just because he was showing active church membership. What was it like as that process unfolded? What was it like to go from a very devout household to a family, a household that was no longer practicing?
Yeah, well, it meant that I was growing up really between two worlds. I think my mom was very supportive of the idea that I was a good Mormon boy. And so when I was with my mom on weekends, she would drive me to church and she would drop me off. She'd pick me up when I was done and was always like very supportive of me being LDS. She never had anything negative to say about the church, which I think requires a lot of restraint, probably on the part of
after that experience.
Yeah, after that experience, right? I think that requires a lot of restraint. My dad's family, and he eventually remarried, and they lived, kind of the law of the church, and he was and is very devout, but I think not necessarily dogmatic in the way that some families are culturally, which I think was good. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, your family especially. I think our experiences growing up with it, I had a much more relaxed upbringing with the church.
Still never drinking coffee, but your family would go out to eat on Sundays.
I think in a lot of ways we were more casual. Like we'd go out to eat if we were out running around, running errands on a Sunday. We would do family home evening, but it was like pretty informal. We'd hang out and just kind of have fun and then, read a little lesson and say a prayer, but it was never super structured. We certainly never had like a, family home evening chart or anything like that I know a lot of families had. I think that, my dad really meant it and really lived it and really lives it to this day. But I think that I was spared a lot of like the really dogmatic kind of programmed worship that a lot of families see.
Would you say as you are going back to see your mom and you're getting these messages at church about forever families and being a member is a prerequisite to get to heaven, were you feeling like you're worried about your mom's salvation and that side of the family? Were you going to them and kind of feeling like they were not as righteous, or did you judge them, basically, is my question?
No, I really don't think so. I think that I learned a lot of kind of code switching between families and what's okay in one place and maybe isn't in the other. I still really meant it. I was really living it all the time, even when I wasn't, when I wasn't with my dad. But I remember at one point my stepdad was carrying groceries in and he asked me to carry his coffee and it was spilling a little bit. It was like very full. And I said, "Oh, this is spilling. It's too full." He said, "Just take a sip of it. It's fine. Just like sip it down." I was like, "No, I can't do that. I can't take a sip of your coffee." So I was really living it, but I didn't feel judgmental or worried that like God wasn't gonna save my mom, right? Like I felt like I knew she was a good human, and I wasn't. I don't know. I felt like we probably weren't giving God enough credit as a kid, right? That like maybe Christ's love was bigger than just his church.
Yeah, it seems like now that I'm thinking of it, it seems like you actually got more judgment from the Mormon side of your family than the non-Mormon side, because the non-Mormon side would see you as this church boy. Mm-hmm. And would ask you to say the prayer and would see you as the kind of religious leader of the family. And then you'd go back to your Mormon side of the family and they would see you as the wayward child.
Yeah, well, I think that, that's true. When I'd go to my mom's house, I was the religious one. And so, if we had Thanksgiving dinner, like I was often the one saying the prayer, my mom would still ask me to give like family members blessings sometimes, right? I think especially at that time, I think that she was spiritual and she believed in the power of faith, even if she wasn't like living that in an LDS context. I kind of ended up filling a religious role, and actually in some ways maybe having more religious responsibility in my mom's house than in my dad's. I think kind of as I became a teenager, like I really gravitated towards, lots of black clothes and, kind of I don't know if a goth aesthetic is right, but I liked wearing a lot of black, and I think that
And you listen to metal music.
I listened to some metal, yeah, and I think that some of those things maybe freaked my dad out and his family a little bit more than it did my mom. And I think there was like maybe a little bit more anxiety that I wasn't like on the path with my dad, whereas I think my mom could roll with a lot of that a little more easily and say, oh, these are probably normal teenager things.
Would you say that as a teenager, when you think back to your memories, were you engaged in any questioning of the church? Were you still forming a testimony? Or did you, even though you were wearing black clothing, did you still have a strong belief throughout that?
Not for all of high school by any means. I think I'm naturally a pretty questioning person, but eventually in high school, I got really into debate. And that led me to spend a lot of time with philosophy and really asking hard questions about like the truth claims of the church. When I was probably 16, I remember having like a pretty serious faith crisis and being really unsure about the kind of veracity of the church's claims.
Which is hilarious because at the same time, me as a 16-year-old, I'm just, I am completely devout and just ultra squeaky clean and believing. So I feel like the two of us getting together was unexpected.
I remember a friend of mine asking me, if the prophet told you to kill someone, would you do it? And I said, no, I think if God wanted me to do that, he'd have to ask me himself. He really was like, well, don't you believe that the prophet is God's messenger? I was like, yeah, but I think that, God has it in his power to communicate with us a little bit more directly than that, if he needs to. So I certainly remember interacting with a lot of people who were much more
just blindly faithful.
Yeah, and like took a lot of those claims on face value. And I remember around that time really having a lot of questions. And I also remember making a conscious decision that I wanted to continue with the church and that I was going to put some of those things kind of on the shelf.
Yeah, why do you think you were willing to put those questions on the shelf rather than letting them air out?
Yeah, well, like 200 years of family tradition and cultural context that's entirely steeped in the church means that it's not exactly easy to just walk away, right?
Especially as a teenager.
Especially as a teenager. I mean, everyone I knew almost was LDS. Most of my cultural context, even in my mom's family, right? Like my mom was not active, but she was raised LDS. Her parents were LDS. Her siblings had all been raised in the church, even if they were out at the time. And most of them expressed, kind of like a little bit of a Jack Mormon sentiment, right? Like more than an ex-Mormon sentiment. They weren't active and they would enjoy beer and coffee and they'd smoke, but they also had a sort of...
They're like almost like the Catholics are like Easter and Christmas Catholics. I feel like that's what a Jack Mormon is. You get reactivated when you want to baptize your kids, or occasionally maybe you'll get your temple recommend back when your kids are getting married so that you can see the wedding. You're not living that very devout lifestyle.
Yeah, and I don't know what they would have said at the time, and I don't know what they'd say today about like what their beliefs are, my mom's family broadly, but I think that it was the cultural expression of spirituality for them, even if it wasn't something that they would say was like literally true. And because of that, it was, the church was a comfortable place. I also remember, this is like a little later, right? This is like shortly before my mission. I remember thinking a lot about this. And I remember thinking, well, everybody needs a community. This happens to be mine. And even if it's not all literally true, these are my people. And I'll be better off living in it than living out of it, and making kind of a conscious, choice at that point.
In Mormon circles, they call it PMO, physically in, mentally out. Would you say you would qualify for that, or did you still have a base enough belief in God and Jesus that you kind of we're still spiritually participatory.
I feel like when people talk about like being PMO, right? Like oftentimes they have the feeling, from what I understand, of being sort of like resentfully held captive. And I didn't feel like that was it for me. I felt like I was making a conscious choice. I felt like I understood that I did actually have options, but that I felt as though this group was the one that I wanted to be associated with. I felt like it was a conscious decision, and I didn't feel coerced, if I guess that's what you're asking. Now I think I did go back and forth some. Like I think I would make like a conscious effort to try and really believe it. And I think that there were times when I could get there, right? But I think that I would vacillate a lot between being really committed and really believing it and kind of going through the motions. And I don't know how unusual that is. I actually think that might be more common than people are willing to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you say then, because as you're going through your teenage years, you are getting all of this messaging about serving a mission,
Yeah.
which is a huge commitment. Based on what you would just said, I almost would guess you wouldn't serve a mission. What was the thought process like in going from this, back and forth of spiritual belief and just kind of participating, and then committing to serve 2 full-time 24/7 years to the church?
Well, I think part of it is that it's like the most important rite of passage for a young Mormon man, like culturally. And there's part of it that seems exciting and fun. And I also think I probably was at like a peak of, I'd worked myself up to that point by being like, okay, I really believe this. I'm committed to it. And I don't think that was totally ironclad. But I think I also had in the back of my mind, this feels like, even if it's not true, this is my community. And
I'm not getting married to a Mormon girl unless I do that.
I mean, yeah, that's part of it too. Part of it is that like, culturally you're like, this is the context I know, and the people I'm, interested in are certainly all Mormon, right? So like that's a piece of it. But it didn't feel like as transactional as that, I think. I think also part of it is that it feels kind of exciting, right? Like going off on a mission, you hear all these stories of people's missions, and it sounds kind of fun and interesting. And
yeah, it's very, I think, especially for boys, but even for girls, it's held up as this, like, the greatest spiritual thing you'll ever do, this great act of service. You represent the Savior. You are going to save souls. I mean, it's very grandiose almost to grow up with these visions of missionaries tromping through jungles and forests, searching for God's children,
Yeah, well, and I think that you also hear like a mission is for the missionary, and I'm like, well, maybe this can really get me that like ironclad testimony.
Yeah. Would you just tell us the story of when you got your mission call and then how you were preparing? I'd love to talk about what your experience was like doing the endowment and the washing and anointing. So if you could launch into that, what was it like to get your mission call?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was living in Las Vegas at the time, and I had put in all my papers, and I was hoping to go to Japan. I'd taken 2 years of Japanese, and I thought that would be amazing. One of my friends had been called to Japan. One of my friends from that same Japanese class had gone to Japan. And so I put that on my papers, and I feel like whoever gave me my mission call was probably like, a blonde white kid. Yeah, Sweden, definitely Sweden. So I got my mission call. I opened it up. I didn't know anything about Sweden, but I was really excited to read that's where I was going.
I think when you're reading your mission call, everyone wants to go on a foreign mission.
Yeah.
So as long as you see that foreign word, you're just excited because it's you don't have to go in the suburbs of the United States like me.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's so funny when I tell people you go to Sweden, they're like, "Wow, where did you go?" And I'm like, Denver, Colorado.
Yeah, that would have been a different experience. But I got the call to Sweden. I was very excited about it. Now, I remember being set apart as a missionary, though.
Which is when they do another blessing.
Yeah, and I remember as soon as that happened, I was like, I don't know if this is the right call. I remember feeling like This is
2 years is actually a really long time.
this is a long time.
He also served when you can't see your family. You get to talk to them on the phone twice a year.
Yep.
You have to be with somebody 24/7. You are working from basically 6:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m.
Yeah, I think it's it's good that the rules have changed so missionaries don't have to be so kind of alienated from their families now. But at the time it was like you have no communication. I mean, other than letters and 2 calls a year with your family at all.
Didn't you have somebody ask you what you would do if your family died?
Yeah. In the MTC, one of the other missionaries asked me if one of my parents died, what I would do. Would I go home? And I said, yeah, I definitely would. I'd want to be there for my family. I would go back.
Jackson is too rational for Mormonism.
And he was like, oh, I don't know about that. I was like, well, would you stay out? He's like, yeah, I definitely would stay out. All right, that's not for me. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and I went on my mission, and I stayed out for the whole 2 years, and I actually really liked it.
Well, before we jump into Sweden, what was the temple like? You got your endowments and garments before going to the MTC.
Yeah, it was weird. It was really weird. I went with my dad. And at the beginning, they do the initiatory. He said to me in the dressing room, getting ready, you put on this thing called a shield, which is like...
I'll put a picture.
Yeah, it's like Dobby the house elf's, like, potato sack or whatever it is that he, like, wears. And it used to be, and you've, I think, talked about this in other videos, that there was a slit in the side of it. You wore nothing underneath it, and the temple worker would put their... Stop it. It used to be that there was a slit in the side and you wore nothing underneath it, and the temple worker would touch you directly on the skin.
And they would bless every part of your body. So they would bless your loins, and they would touch right above the loins.
Yeah.
So that's what your dad would have experienced.
Yeah. And so he was trying to prepare me, and he goes...
So he didn't realize they had changed it?
Not for the first time. I think he thought that the first time it was still the same.
Wow.
So he said to me, hey... don't put your garments on when you put the what they call the shield on.
So naked under the shield.
Yeah, you could tell. Still felt like it was maybe a little weird when he'd gone through. And then I got there, and they, I think, sent me back and had me change.
Put your underwear.
Yeah, basically, because the way they did it had changed. And they were just touching outside the shield.
Isn't it sad too how he wanted to prepare you, but since it's such a secret, he can't tell you what's going to happen. So your dad is just like, hey, son, don't put your underwear on. And you're like, that's all? Any explanation?
And I'd looked up all about the temple before I went in, which big no, you're not supposed to do. But the temple prep classes that they have you go through don't tell you anything. It's just like, the temple is a place where we share symbols. And a symbol is defined as... whatever. It doesn't give you any preparation for what's actually going to happen in the temple.
So you watched the video.
I watched the video. Yeah. And the old video with, like, opera Satan, it was dope. It got so much worse over time, I have to say. So all of you who missed, like, the OG videos with Satan, who reigns with blood and terror on this earth, like, I'm sorry for you if you missed that. That was really great.
If you want a full explanation, you'll have to watch my other videos about it, because it's a lot to get into.
Watch her temple videos, but the video that they play in the temple has gotten worse over time. Now
it's a slideshow. They've made it more boring, basically.
Wow, celestial PowerPoint. That's like so Mormon, so corporate. We get into the celestial room, which is the room after kind of the main ceremony happens.
So you do the handshakes.
Did all the handshakes.
Chanting.
Stumbled through, kind of all of the oaths and you're supposed to say.
The handshakes.
Yes, the handshakes.
You stand through the veil. Health in the navel, marrow in the bones.
Power in the priesthood. It was a strange experience. It was really weird. Everything about it seemed totally unfamiliar from my upbringing in the church. And to some degree, it was interesting because I feel like, there was always kind of like this mocking tone that Mormons would take when they talk about, like, Catholics and all their rituals and all their dressed up, ceremonies and whatnot. And I get to the temple and I'm like, are you guys talking about? This is like even weirder. We make it to the other side of into the celestial room, which is the room, kind of white, super gaudy waiting room that you sit in and pray and read scriptures after you've gone through the ceremony. And my dad goes, "So what'd you think?" I'm like, yeah, it's a lot to take in. That was something. We went and got dressed back in our street clothes, and we went to Five Guys, and is some family friends had also come with us. So we all sat around and kind of
everyone starts like kind of raising their eyebrows at you, like, huh?
Wow, yeah,
part of the club now.
Part of the club. And I did not have a lot to say about it. It was very strange. And it did not make me feel better when I then eventually went and got set apart. I think that was something where I was like, this is pretty weird. This is pretty strange.
So you have this crazy temple experience. It's maybe a week or two before you get set apart. You're in the MTC. You're now wearing garments. And you have 2 years ahead of you in Sweden. First, can you say hello in Swedish for us?
Hey.
Oh, that's
it's just that easy.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Maybe give us a little more than that. How are you doing?
Jättebra, tack.
Okay, I'm good. What did you have for breakfast?
Coffee.
That's not very exciting.
No, it's not. It's not a hard language, really, for English speakers.
It's kind of like Spanish, almost. Like, there's a lot of words that are very similar.
Yeah, the Germanic languages. It's not a super difficult language.
How about you introduce yourself as a missionary, like if you're knocking on the door?
Hej, jag heter Elster Carpenter. Vi är missionär med Jesu Kristi kyrka och sista dagens heliga. Tror du att familjer kan vara tillsammans i evighet? It's been a long time. But you just,
I'll get baptized.
You'll get baptized. Yeah. Done. Sold.
Done.
Flirt to convert.
So what was it like once you got there and you're learning the language and...
Yeah, so the MTC was very regimented, and I don't think I'm like a big rules guy, and I really don't like being kind of told what to do, and the MTC is just being told what to do.
They really baby you.
Constantly. So that drove me a little crazy.
Oh, tell us the story of the basketball or whatever.
Oh, yeah, good example of this. So one of our few joys in the MTC was playing Foursquare. And they hire these kids from BYU to sit and like babysit you while you're in gym. And
they have a whistle even, right?
They have a whistle, and they have a lot of rules about what you are and aren't allowed to do. They're really, really trying to prevent missionaries from getting injured. And that means that you're not allowed to like do anything that could result in like a sprained ankle. Like they're very, very, very strict. So we were playing Foursquare, and some of the kids were getting like a little competitive, and we're like kind of diving for the ball. And so this very zealous young BYU student blows his whistle and comes over and takes our ball from us. He's like, no more Foursquare for you. So we decide that we're going to keep playing Foursquare with no ball. And so we're like, tossing the ball, and we're really committing to it. And the student I could see getting like more and more irritated as he's watching us just like openly flaunt. We have like a line of people like next to the court. So we're like continuing to like, someone will get out and go, oh, and rotate out. And finally, this one guy, gets the fake invisible ball served to him, and he full on dives onto the court for it to try and save it. And another whistle is blown. He comes over, chews us out, tells us to get out of there. And it was worth it. It was absolutely. We didn't get any more Foursquare for a week. We lost Foursquare for a week because of that. But
I can't believe at 19 years old you're having your ball taken from you.
That was the birth of our favorite secret combination, the Soul Squarers. We started a secret combination. Yeah, that was the MTC experience, and it wasn't all bad. Some of the friends I made there, I'm still friends with today. I didn't really like being told what to do. I didn't love the food.
How long were you there?
Experience
12 weeks.
9 weeks.
9 weeks. Okay.
9 weeks. Yeah, we're not that. Swedish isn't that difficult.
It depends on the complexity of the language is how long you're there. So I was only there for 13 days or something. I think something like Mandarin or Japanese 12. Would be 12.
Yeah.
You were 9.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So you arrive in Sweden. Tell us the first few months. What was it like?
I was in a little town called Vecqua in kind of southern part of the country. And it was a long way from other missionary areas, and it was a huge area. And that meant that I really didn't interact that much with missionaries other than my trainer, but it was it was great. I was very committed, actually. I felt like I really kind of bought in. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting. It took me a while to you have to say in the comments if you served a foreign mission. Like, I found it took some weeks before I understood enough of the language to like really participate in a lot of the conversations we were having, but it was a good time.
Did you have converts? How many converts did you have?
How many?
Everyone always hears Sweden and they are like, who in Sweden is listening to Mormonism?
We had a decent number. I'm doing the mental math right now.
Maybe just an estimate.
It was probably like 5 or so, 5 or 6, something like that. I have them all written down somewhere, but it was like 5 or 6.
So according to Google, there's about 10,000 Mormons in Sweden. That's a pretty good amount.
Yeah, in a country of 9 million people, it's maybe a drop in the bucket. But yeah, they had some decent wards. There are some cities and neighborhoods that had a lot of Mormons up kind of near the temple in Stockholm. There was a really good community. There was a decent population in Gothenburg, a decent population in...
Where's the temple?
There's a temple in Stockholm, and then the other temple that Swedes go to is in Copenhagen in Denmark. So I got to go to Denmark a few times. That was fun. I think that overall, also, I think fortunately, my mission wasn't crazy strict. I hear stories of some, missionaries who had like really, really restrictive missions. I don't think that would have worked well for me. I think I would have been really miserable. But, for the most part, I think all the standard missionary rules apply. It still seems very strict from the perspective of not being Mormon at all.
Yeah.
But I thought a really good mission president who, had decent perspective and wasn't interested in babysitting, adults. So I think he gave us a long leash, and I think that was helpful.
Yeah, I feel like, too, on top of being in a foreign country, I always had to live with members, so they'd be breathing down your back. You'd get into the apartment and it'd say, take 5-minute showers, and it'd be a whole list of rules. And then when you're out riding your bike or in the car, you see members all the time, and they're gossiping about you sometimes. And it seems like you were truly just on your own, more or less.
Yeah, I think that, in a lot of the areas we're in, we wouldn't see members except on Sundays, and maybe we'd get one meal during the week if we were lucky in most of the areas. There were some areas where we had, people who took really, really, really good care of the missionaries, but they were usually like extremely pleasant. They didn't ever seem to be
bossing you around
or judging you. Yeah, I had one family, actually, someone in this family sometimes watches these videos, so hi. But one family would feed us in one area like 3 times a week, which is crazy for Sweden. And were super, super nice to us, super kind to us, took really good care of us.
Are they still in that church?
Some of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of families like that took really good care of the missionaries, but they never had that kind of edge of judgment, and usually seem to really, really just want to make our experience better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like you have so many more people from your mission or from who you taught that have left. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's the opposite. Most are still practicing. Most are still getting married, popping out babies. And we just had 2 totally different experiences.
Yeah. And well, I think Sweden also is an environment in which, like, if you're LDS in Sweden, chances are good that you're interacting continuously with people who aren't members, that you have a lot of your family who's not members. And so I think that there's a nuance there. And I also think that, like, just given that there are not that many members, missionaries actually play like a really important role in the infrastructure of the church in a lot of the wards and branches around the country. And that means that you're treated also a little more seriously. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not treated like
the dorky kid missionaries coming around.
Yeah, because I know that, like, in my wards in Utah, missionaries were, usually, treated like they were kids. And I think we actually had the opportunity to, like, really help because there really just weren't enough people to do everything that needed to be done in order to keep a ward or a branch functioning. And so we were mostly treated with respect, and members, I thought, took good care of us and weren't overly. It never felt like we were like being watched by the members.
Did any of the questioning that you had in your teenage years still pop up? Like, did you have any experiences where you kind of were questioning still, or were you all on board at that point?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that happen when you're a missionary, at least for me. One is that you get to see the church operating as, I guess, almost like a corporate structure. And you get to see that even among like area authorities who come to visit and like the mission president and, general authorities and leaders in the church, there is still friction and politics. It's not all harmonious. And that not everything runs well, and that not everything seems to be inspired. And going to a radically different cultural context and country and seeing people who are living happily without Mormonism, and that like that's possible to do, like people who'd never heard of the church living perfectly happy lives, and many of them seeming like they wouldn't really even be benefited by converting. It's hard to argue with that. I think that while I was on my mission, I was making a really concerted effort to lean into my faith and to doubt my doubts as much as I could. But I don't think I was like a particularly dogmatic missionary. One of my companions called me a born-again Mormon. I really preferred teaching out of the New Testament and the Bible because I didn't feel entirely comfortable with.
Everyone's gonna be so sad that you're not a Christian still.
Yeah, well, I think that I felt a lot more comfortable with the Bible than I did with the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I always felt like one of the weirdest experiences was meeting a family that was willing to hear from us, and they were really happy, well off, successful, great kids. Not a problem that we could find, and you almost have to reverse engineer convincing them that they are not happy and that they have deficiencies and that they need to join in order to cure those deficiencies that they don't even, that you have to teach them about. They have, you have to teach them about the deficiency and then create the cure. And it felt almost cruel to try to be telling people that, you're not going to be with your family in the afterlife.
Yeah,
and
you're so happy now, and the church can make sure that happiness lasts forever, right? I wasn't teaching a lot of families, though. I will say in Sweden, not a lot of people were interested in hearing from Mormon missionaries. The people we talked to mostly were students who had to do an assignment on religions of the world, and they had to talk to religious clergy, and Mormon missionaries counted. And I gave some talks to like high school classes and was interviewed by
they're like,
students.
This weirdo.
Yeah, these crazies. I remember having an argument about marriage with a group of like, cynical Swedish teens, and then I also remember telling them that I asked them by raise of hands, who here smokes, and like half of them raised their hands. And it's like, you're so young, you have to quit, you have to change that now. But then the other group that you end up talking a lot with, Sweden has a really big population of immigrants from all over the world, who tend to be more religious. Not always, but tend to be more religious than Swedes, and because of that are more interested in questions of God, and they're more likely to talk to you. But in terms of like talking to, established Swedish families, like that is very, very rare that someone like that would want to
Would they
to us.
even let you in the door, or would they answer? Would they just say, go away?
Normally, you don't even knock into them,
Okay.
honestly, because you wind up spending most of your time in apartment buildings that are occupied mostly by single people. We'd go knock on houses occasionally, but you just didn't have nearly as much success. The vast majority of them wouldn't let you in.
So you get home from your mission, you meet me. What was it, 2 years? I guess cover the time between coming home. What were you up to? And then, of course, when your life really started.
Of course. So I get home, I get a job almost immediately as a copywriter, actually. Yeah, clicky. Like 9 or so months later, had a little bit of money saved, ended up quitting that job, going back to Europe with a friend of mine. We landed in Norway and we toured around Norway, southern Sweden, a little bit in like Copenhagen, and then we flew to the UK. And he went off to Cambridge, and I hitchhiked around Western Europe for a while. Actually, ended up going to, this is a funny little experience. Ended up in Finland at a thing called Festanord, which is like the big young single adult conference in the Nordics. And it's really funny because I feel like half of the couples I met in Sweden who were Mormon met at Festanord. So I went to Festanord. That was interesting. Yeah, ended up flying home, got another job, and was just plugging away in the salt mines and living with a friend of mine from high school. He was engaged. He introduced me to his future sister-in-law, who was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. That was Alyssa.
So Jackson was friends with someone from high school. He got married to my sister, and then they introduced me to Jackson. So
yes, while they were still engaged.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how we met.
And we've told some of that story in this video, where we kind of went through our whole courtship, the Alyssa games.
The Alyssa games. You got to watch.
Yeah, watch that video if you want to hear about that. But maybe since we've already told a little bit of that story, we can, and it sounds like you were still, after your mission, you're believing, you're holding callings, you're paying your tithing.
Yeah.
I mean, when I met you, we were going to the temple together. We would go to church together. You'd come with me to my Wednesday night activity that I was having at the time. We really just on paper were a perfect Mormon couple, dating, got married quickly. So we got married. You can watch this video for that. A lot of these stories I've already told, but I'd love to zero in on the moments of us leaving. And we left around the same time. So maybe pick us up where that story begins in your mind.
Sure. So at the time, we were both working, and I was doing night classes at BYU. One of those classes was the Foundation of the Restoration, which covers kind of from a faithful perspective, early church history. I called it Defense Against the Dark Arts. And the final project for that class was just picking a historical topic from the church and creating some kind of communication or media around it. And so what I did is I actually created a timeline of all of Joseph Smith's polygamous marriages, from Fanny Alger through his death. And I wrote an essay to go with it. And I remember diving into all of these relationships and feeling like I had known in general about polygamy. I'd known about some of these relationships, but doing a deep dive into each one, it makes it pretty difficult to justify Joseph Smith at the end of that.
Because there's so many. I mean, there's more than 30 underage girls, women who were already married, and then
sisters, mother-daughter combos, and like many of them were like, coerced into marriages or had been married, already polygamously married to the apostles who Joseph Smith then sent off on missions, then married while they were gone. It was messy. It was really messy. And in this essay I wrote, which I actually just reread the other day.
Well, I'll link it below. Yeah?
Yeah. I'll
share with you.
I'll share a copy of it. I remember I kind of ended with I'm not really sure what to do with this, but I guess I'll stick with it. And I talked to, because it was quite a big research project. It was like much bigger than I think the class actually required. I put a lot of time into it. I was sorry if any of my former employers are watching this, but I was spending like a lot of time like at work too. I was just like pouring over this. I remember talking to this BYU professor who, is a professor of history at BYU. He has shelves and shelves and shelves full of books on this time period. And I said, what am I supposed to do? Like, is this right? Like, is this correct? Do I have it wrong somewhere? And he said, no, this is all accurate. And at the time, I also was actually emailing with Brian Hales, who's like one of the big apologists for the church. And I was like, is this correct? And, we had a whole exchange about it. But I was just getting in front of anyone I could who was like a faithful, someone I perceived as like a faithful expert, say, what should I do with this? And I remember this BYU professor said to me, that's pretty disturbing, isn't it? And I was like, that's it? That's all you got for me? And I couldn't find anyone, any faithful member who would sit down with me and talk about this and have anything to say that was comforting, right? If they tried to make a defense, it was always very thin. And usually they didn't. Usually they just said, yeah, it's a hard thing. We don't understand. We don't know. And that really wasn't enough for me. Now, around that time, I guess I was an elders quorum president. Then we changed wards, and kind of funny. My boss at the time, wonderful guy, great dude, was a faithful member. The ward we moved into, he was the elders quorum president. So my elders quorum president was also my boss, which
happens a lot in Utah. Your boss is in leadership over you at church.
At church, yeah. So I was like trying to really keep all of this quiet in other areas of my life as I was questioning. And I remember at one point like drinking coffee at work, and he walked up to talk to me, and I was like,
cover the cup. Well, also at that time, I was still attending BYU, and if you admit to any of this while you're a student, you are truly risking. There are people who have been kicked out for having a faith crisis. So I also had told Jackson, like, we got to keep this quiet because I have to get my degree, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, and I remember around that time, you started having your faith crisis, which you've talked about at some length, and, you'd kind of not attended for some weeks, and then you'd come back, and you had an experience that you talked about in one of your other videos, and then left. And I was still attending through this time. And I think part of that was, well, my boss is my elders quorum president. Part of it is also like, I also wanted to be sure.
I feel like almost you did the same thing you did the first time, which is, this is my community. There are good people found here.
Yeah, and I remember having conversations with like friends who had left the church at that time and saying basically that, like, this is my community, and I'm prepared to stand by it. And even if it's not true, I'm still living a good life here within this church. And I think that you leaving made it feel more like, I could be okay with those doubts and be okay with the risk of losing community elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we had seen so many people who had been got divorced because of a faith crisis. And it almost felt like if either of us had doubts, I think it was still somewhat scary at the time, what's going to happen. I remember I had initiated the doubting conversation, and maybe a few months went by, and then you were the first to say, I don't believe anymore. So it was almost like I was at the front and I was working on it, and I was kind of like a tortoise, and Jackson's the hare, just, he came to the conclusion much more quickly. And so it was, we were doing this thing where I would go forward and and I think that was really scary for me when you said, I don't believe anymore, because I was like, wait, I'm not there yet. And I'm not sure if I want to go there. And it was a really intimidating time, even just for a few months.
Yeah, and it was a mercifully short period. I think if I'm honest with myself, I think I'd come to the conclusion it wasn't true many times before I said, okay, I can be okay with saying to myself, like, this is not true. I think I'd probably come to that conclusion, I don't know, half a dozen times before, and had walked back from it. At that point, it felt like it was maybe okay to embrace that finally, after, at that point, I don't know, 6 or 7 years of really being back and forth on it.
Yeah, it's almost like since you were 15, you'd been pushing this beneath the surface, and maybe you just needed somebody who maybe, to make sure you still were going to have a wife. Make sure that, I don't know, not that it was that calculated, but like, I feel like almost you need a friend who's going to be there and love you and support you. I feel like there's a lot of people who, as soon as one family member leaves, a few others leave, because it's not that they lead them out of the church. It's that it's so hard to do alone that until you have someone to support you and love you and be with you through it, it's really, you just are like, I'll just stay. It's easier to just stay.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we played probably a role for each other of
Yeah.
being like, we're not going to be, I don't know, alone. Like we're not going to be, lose all our family and friends and not have anyone in the world if we leave. And that makes it easier, I think, to walk away.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like people who do it alone have a much more difficult road because they become alienated from their family and maybe get divorced and their kids start hating them. And it's so, you have so much to lose
Yeah.
when you leave the church that a lot of people truly are just like, I'm just gonna, it's not worth it. And so I think we both played that role for each other, which was really cool. It was scary, but it was really cool, I think.
I was talking a lot about that idea of having like a community or like a tribe. I think that when you're single, the loyalty to the group or the tribe looms large. And I think at a certain point, like once we're married, it feels like, well, my loyalty is actually first to Alyssa, not to this kind of broad group of people who share a religious designation with me, right? Or to my ancestors or to whatever. Like it feels a lot easier to walk away once that loyalty has shifted and your primary loyalty is now to the person you're married to, not to the church broadly, or the church as a cultural group.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories of us leaving is when you bore your anti-testimony to the bishop. If you want to tell that story.
Yeah. I think maybe this kind of freaked you out when it happened. You have to tell me what your reaction was. But we were really trying, I think, like genuinely to find someone who would tell us that the conclusions we were coming to were incorrect, right? That we were wrong.
Yeah, I think it's what you're taught to do, which is to seek authority, go to your bishop, go to your dad, go to your mission president, and you truly have a sincere belief that they're going to be able to pull some rabbit out of the hat and say, here's the thing that makes it all better. And so you had gone to your professor, I was talking to my parents, I had reached out to some former mission companions, and I think that at some point during this process we had said, well, let's go talk to the bishop. We will lay our cards on the table, we'll say we're having this problem, and maybe he's going to be able to give us some counsel to how to stay in the church. So that's how this all came to be.
Yeah, so we go and sit down in front of this guy and start laying our concerns out. And he told us he didn't want to get into them. He didn't want to talk about them.
He basically was just like, I choose not to know about any of those things.
Yeah.
It wasn't even that he didn't want to get into them. It was like he said, I've purposefully never learned about any of this because I don't want to lose my testimony.
Yeah, and I start laying out that like I'd been in this class at BYU and I'd written this paper and I'd spent all this time, digging into source material and making this timeline of Joseph Smith's polygamy. He didn't want to talk about any of it. And something like, snapped inside me. Maybe say like the shelf finally broke, that heaving, cracked shelf finally broke. I bore my anti-testimony to him. I said, I feel at this point certain that Joseph Smith is not a prophet of God, that he was not inspired. I think that the historical evidence is overwhelming. I think that it's clear that there's massive gaps in the story that the church tells us, and that it's not supported by the historical record, that the Book of Mormon isn't supported by the archaeological record. And I just don't see how I can continue to believe in this church.
And the bishop just sat there and was like,
yeah, I was like,
went to nowhere land, disassociated.
Totally glazed over. Yeah, totally glazed over. And we didn't have any relationship with this guy. He just happened to be our bishop. Yeah,
we had just moved there. So we were only there for 6 months. It's not like he had some long-standing personal relationship with either of us, but yeah, I do remember you saying all of that and just feeling like, oh my God, I can't believe you're saying this to the bishop. Because eventually I did a similar thing in Relief Society, because I think when we left the bishop's office, it wasn't the last time we attended church. It was almost like a failed attempt at resolving these concerns. It's not like we had said, well, this is the last time you're ever going to see us. It was more like, please help us. And then he, didn't have any ability to help us. And I think when you said all of those things, I was still personally in the throes of indecision. And so when you're saying all of this, and I hadn't graduated from BYU yet, I think first I was a little worried, like, what if he takes away my ecclesiastical endorsement, which he didn't do, and I think would have been somewhat atypical because we were in a kind of confessionary meeting with him, but I was still worried because stranger things have happened where people will just call BYU and be like, I'm removing their ecclesiastical endorsement because, and I didn't, maybe that's why I didn't say I don't believe in Joseph Smith anymore, because to get my degree I had to believe in Joseph Smith, but I do remember that and feeling like I just felt like the earth was just falling away from beneath us. Like, I was just like, man, I am going from just this ultra believing member that's never questioned to now this is my life. Like, it just, I almost felt like I was also disassociating a little bit.
Well, I remember feeling so angry at him because I was like, didn't Jesus have like a whole sermon about leaving the 90 and 9 to save the one? And this guy could not be bothered to engage with what we were saying. And I understand he's just a guy and he was, scared and overwhelmed, and he probably didn't ask to be bishop, and he probably was I don't know, like a CPA or something.
Yeah.
Like, he has no training in this.
Also his literally, when you are a bishop in Utah, it's likely that his entire life is predicated on the church. His job, if he leaves the church, he loses his job, he loses his kids, because they'll think he's a bad dude. The woman will get the custody because she's the Mormon. And, it's like he as you're saying, as you're bringing this to these people, they're just like, I'm not about to say anything that would jeopardize my position that I've worked for decades to build within this church.
Yeah.
That's my perspective, at least.
Yeah, I think it is all too human. But it is a perfectly human response. But I remember sitting after that in our car in the parking lot of our apartment building, kind of debriefing after all of this, and I really felt like that was the beginning of the end. I think that was the first time I'd ever really let myself say all of my doubts, certainly that strongly, out loud. And it wasn't planned, and it wasn't, it was just in the moment. I felt so betrayed by the church, and this poor guy became like the totem of the church for me to express all of my frustrations and incredulity with. I wasn't like angry, but I laid it all out there to this guy, and it was made worse by the fact that he wasn't responding or trying to defend the church.
It's just like, how many times do you hear people bear their testimony? I know this church is true. I know it's true. And passion testimony. So it's like when you're down to the wire and then they have nothing, you're like, I've given years of my life.
Yeah.
And you have nothing for me? Like, you have nothing to help me stay. You're just like, well, I don't really want to get into that. And it feels like a betrayal, even if he's just some dude being human. It feels like you've given so much, and then there's your BYU professor's just like, yep, it's pretty bad. And you're like, you couldn't have told me this?
Which, I also understand. Like, the BYU professor has a job and a set of qualifications that he can't take anywhere else. Yeah. There's no other job he can do. That's his job.
No one else is exactly hiring a faithful Mormon historian.
Yeah, which I think, the difference maybe between like this BYU professor, telling me, yeah, it's pretty disturbing, isn't it? That versus talking to Brian Hales, for example, who I'd corresponded with a little bit, is just that I feel like on the one hand, you have an apologist who's committed to being an apologist for the church and is willing to make arguments, even if I didn't feel like they were very convincing arguments, is willing to make arguments for the church's veracity, versus people who are I think my BYU professor was being authentic. Like, I think he did find it very disturbing and didn't have a good answer for it. But the pressures of his life meant that he was never going to be able to walk away without a cost that he wasn't willing to bear. And I think the same may be true of that bishop, right? Just the cost of engaging with us would have been higher than he was willing to bear. And I think you can... I can have empathy for that. I get it. I think, one part of leaving is also understanding that, like, in a different set of circumstances, the members that you interface with, like, you could be them. If things worked out differently, you could be them. And I think that's something I also try to tell, like, active members I talk with today, is that, like, I know you don't believe...
There's a lot of empathy.
And I try to... I know you don't believe this, but someday you could be where I'm at. to the active members I'm talking to. Like, I've been where you're at, and you really can be where I'm at. And so please try and have like the understanding and the empathy to say, like, we're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like that level of empathy is very, I know they don't believe that we understand them, but I sincerely think that I do understand where they're coming from, and almost want them to be able to see, like, hey, you see how everyone is demonizing me right now, and everyone I thought loved me unconditionally is ditching me. I hope you see that this could happen to you, and that you have a little bit of empathy to just understand that what I'm going through is really challenging, and maybe consider how you would want to be treated if this ever happens to you. But I'd love for you to share what it was like when you lost your testimony. What was it like when you broke the news to your family?
So I remember we kept it pretty quiet from our families until we were pretty sure what was going on. I remember, floating that I had some doubts.
Soft launch.
Yeah, soft launch to my dad, and we spent a fair amount of time talking about it. And he was, kind and I think pretty understanding. And then I remember going to help him with taking some stuff to the dump or something. He had some construction project, was taking some stuff to the dump, and I wasn't wearing garments that day, and he mentioned that he noticed, and we talked a little bit about that. And I think he was pretty gentle through that process. I think he was pretty kind through that process, which I appreciated. He didn't react angrily at all. I remember some uncomfortable kind of family dinners during that time. I think, overall it went at the time as well as I could have hoped. I think that since that's played into maybe a more difficult relationship with my family, and I think it's really hard to kind of communicate across some of the faith divides that emerge.
It's almost, I was talking to somebody recently who left their church but is also gay, and he was talking about the similarities, and I feel like the process is very similar. There's obviously a lot of differences, but this aspect of coming out to your parents, and even if they're nice about it, or they want to still love you, it's basically like you're now, at least in my experience, I feel like you're now just the black sheep a little bit. You're your failed expectations. You had this grand future in front of you, and you've just fallen short of it. And in my experience, I feel like it just colors every interaction thereafter, where you're still talking and you're still loving each other in the capacity that you can, but you just know that you are fundamentally a disappointment. And I feel like that's the reason I bring up the coming out of the closet comparison, is I feel like I've had a lot of friends who are gay who've shared the same experience, where they've broken the news and the family will still kind of accept them, but they'll say, hey, don't show, no PDA, or don't bring them home, or, if you bring coffee into the room, it's kind of like, it's like there's just a tension there that is almost impenetrable.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of subsequent, interpersonal challenges that come up in human relationships and in families can be, and in my case certainly, have been like greatly exacerbated by the question of faith, and like what could have been, if not easily surmountable obstacle, but at least a surmountable one, becomes this kind of insurmountable divide because of the amplification of the question of leaving the church.
So we are fully out. We're ready to go. We're on the train out of the station. What are some of your favorite memories of those first months where we're just going crazy?
I remember our first time going to get coffee together. We went to a little coffee shop in downtown Salt Lake, and we got the sweetest mochas you could imagine, and sat and drank them together and talked. I think it might have even been on like a Sunday.
Yeah, I think it was.
And it was just kind of a fun little experience, drinking this cloyingly sweet coffee and, just talking about all the crazy changes in our life around that time and what that would mean for our future and our trajectory. I remember some friends of ours who had actually left the church ahead of us set up a beer tasting for us.
That was really nice.
I think because the word of wisdom is so like strict, it ends up being a lot of, and so unusual, it ends up being like that a lot of your novel experiences around leaving the church have to do with like coffee and beer and, you know, drinking and that sort of thing. And I think it's easy for that to seem like very shallow, but I don't know, it was a lot of fun. I remember we had like, you know, probably 20 local beers that they'd got for us, or mostly local beers they got for us. We tried like a little bit of each of them.
Yeah, and I feel like it's about more than just trying coffee. It's about more than just drinking. It's more about, I think, reclaiming this narrative of these things are evil and just allowing yourself to experience, you know, drinking coffee without guilt, which is something that people have done most of their adult life. But I feel like, I think that, you know, the narrative that you only left the church to sin, I think is common because they want to have an excuse as to why you would walk away from your faith, only because you were tempted by the world. But I also think it is common to see ex-Mormons get a tattoo, get a piercing, post a picture with a cocktail. And I know that may add to this narrative of you leave to sin. But I think on the other side of the experience, it feels much more like you're just reclaiming these very normal, everyday things, and that you're kind of sharing with the world. I'm not ashamed of this. I'm not ashamed of who I am, and there's nothing wrong with me. I don't know.
You leave and you realize it's not a sin, I think, is a big part of it. And figuring out like, well, what do I want my life to look like now that I'm out? I also remember around this time, my company had a work retreat. We were staying in cabins at Bear Lake, actually. For those of you who are Utahns, you'll know where that is. They had drinking and non-drinking cabins because the majority of the staff was LDS. So they had like a party cabin, and then they had kind of all the rest of them. I went to the party cabin, and they were playing Cards Against Humanity and taking shots. And it's my first time like being in a social setting outside of like just our very close friends.
Yeah, I think
and outside of
that was the first time you drank with anyone other than me, right? I mean, that was really...
the first time I drank and you weren't there.
Yeah.
And boy, if it's your first time drinking, take it slow. I was just drinking whatever. I told my coworkers this was my first time really drinking outside of, you know, just me and Alyssa. And they very graciously hooked me up with shot after shot of everything under the sun. And finally, I was like, I need to drink some water. So I'm drinking some water. I'm talking to these two guys, and one of them makes a joke. And I laugh so uncontrollably in my like kind of tipsy stupor that I spit out my drink all over these guys' shirts.
Oh my gosh.
And it was so embarrassing. But they started laughing. They thought it was hilarious. I mean, they were really good sports about it. I had a good laugh. I don't know that I've ever been so hungover though in my life as I was the next morning. So yeah, take it easy if you're fresh out of the church.
It is one of my favorite things.
It's not a race.
I feel like when we've had many friends who have left the church after we left the church, and it always is, it's kind of fun to just try a drink with them for the first time, or, you know, try going shopping for a tank top, or, you know, I think that people in that state, like I feel like we had that with those friends who did the beer night. It's almost like it's really cool to have friends who are ready and there to greet you with the Welcome to the Exmo Club shirts. And I think, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people who were there with you that night had been involved with the church at some point. And so they're very understanding and probably even excited to show you the ropes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so those were some fun experiences. I think also like just realizing that it's going to be okay. Right. And that like it's not all over. I think for people who are kind of like on the fence, thinking about leaving, like take your time, no rush. But once you're pretty sure, go for it. Just, you know, move on, move past the church. I think that like there are a lot of people who I talk to who wind up stuck in this limbo. And maybe that's like a lot of the people who are PMO, right? Like physically and mentally out. I think that a lot of people in that position seem like they're afraid of what life after the church will be like. Most people I talk to, it's better. It's okay. You don't have to rush. You're on your own timetable, but when you're pretty sure, it'll be all right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who I've met who have been out of the church for years, but then they never find anything to replace it with. And they're I think limbo is a good word for it, because they still have never tried coffee. They still kind of are just associating mostly with members, but they're not really fully welcome in the same way they used to be, but they don't go find a new community. So it is, I think a lot of people leave, but then don't actively pursue a new course, which is actually what my book is mostly about, is finding ways to rebuild your life after leaving this all-encompassing religion. I think everyone would be curious to know, though, what do you believe in now?
What do I believe in
what
now?
do you believe in?
Well, I think around the time we left, I went through kind of like the whole repertoire of, the new atheist work, and it was, Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and you have like a nice little like angry atheist phase. There's nothing wrong with that phase, right? Like that's an important place to be, and if that's where you end up, that's okay. I don't think I ever had an urge to like go to a different church. I don't think I was ever like, I need to replace this with some other faith. There's actually a philosopher who I really came to like, named Baruch Spinoza. He was a kind of Enlightenment era Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated from his Jewish community in the Netherlands for his heretical views. And he painted this picture of the universe for me that was really compelling. And the idea that we're all kind of part of one continuous universe and substance, and that there's an inherent brotherhood of all creation and oneness of all creation. And one of the things I appreciated about his work, and appreciate still about his work, is there's nothing in it that's asking you to believe anything supernatural, that's asking you to set aside your reason or take anything on faith. It's just a description of the way things are, as far as we know, and a shift in perspective that I think reintroduces some wonder to the universe without having to set your reason aside. And I appreciate that a lot. I think that perspective shift, you'll occasionally hear people in that kind of angry atheist phase say like, well, I think we just rot in the ground and there's nothing there. And, in a way that feels as though it's making light of like the mystery of the universe. And I think there's still a lot of mystery there, even if you don't have faith in the traditional sense, right? I think that there's still a lot of wonder there. I think that there's still a lot of sense of awe and of, source of unity and mystery without having to set your reason aside. So I don't know what you call that. I think a lot of people would say, well, you're an atheist, and I guess maybe an atheist with a sense of wonder at all of this.
I like that. Yeah. And I think, in all of our conversations, I would say we still don't necessarily have the same it's almost too much to call it a belief, or maybe it's a life philosophy.
Outlook.
Yeah, outlook. I think you probably are a little bit more down that path as you just described than I am. I'm probably just, stuck in the angry atheist phase. I'm not really angry. It's more like the spiritual realm, or like even seeing anything past what is in the here and now. It doesn't appeal to me necessarily. I feel like maybe my wonderment is more just in the day-to-day and moment-to-moment versus universe, but I don't know. I feel like we are probably, what would you call it? I don't know. We're like very similar.
Yeah, I think so.
I would say you enjoy reading a lot more books about these topics. You enjoy reading a lot more like philosophy or listening to podcasts about this type of way of thinking about the world, and I'm more just like listening to the news, or I don't delve quite as deep into a lot of these types of thought experiments or ways of viewing the world or outlooks, but I wouldn't say that we're like fundamentally different either.
But I think that if you're if you are a deep doctrine kind of Mormon and you want to dive into the the spirituality of like physicists, there's a lot there. And I think that you don't have to leave behind kind of the deep doctrine of the universe just because you are no longer Mormon, right? I think there's still something there that's worth investigating if it interests you. But you're right. I don't think that there's
it's like I think we probably have the same general outlook, but you do more reading and go down that rabbit hole a lot more than I do. Whereas my rabbit hole is the church, basically.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the one of the great things about no longer being in organized religion is that there's no one to prescribe a right way for you.
Oh, it's very fluid. And I think I feel like I still sometimes, last night I actually had a really awful dream about our house being haunted. And I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, what if devils are real? And then in about an hour later, I was like, well, that was a dumb dream. But I do feel like, sometimes I do still open myself up to say, hey, like, if I change my mind, if I join some other church, if I even, I don't know, I'm no longer committed to this idea that I had when I was Mormon, which is that I will only be one way for my entire life. And that is set in stone, and I'm going to be immovable, and I'm not going to learn other ways. I'm just going to pursue this one path. I would say one change is that I'm not imminently sure about anything. And now it's much more just investigative, I want to learn about this, I want to learn about that. And it's not so staunchly like dogmatic about the way I'm approaching belief.
So cue all the evangelicals in the comments.
About the devils?
No, about you being open-minded to, not set in your atheist way.
Well, they're already here. They've been sending me messages for months, so. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. If you have any questions for Jackson or for me, drop them in the comments. I'll be coming in to answer any questions that we didn't get to. This was a pretty quick overview of the whole story. This is years of lived experience. So thank you for coming on to share your
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to my channel. I have a new video every single week on the church, the doctrine, Mormon history, our stories. So if you want to see that, don't forget to hit subscribe. And as always, I will see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.